Thank you for joining us for a very special discussion on maritime cybersecurity. I am Dr. Mark Grzegorzewski, and today I'll be interviewing the authors of Raising the Colors, Signaling for Cooperation on Maritime Cybersecurity. They are William Loomis and Dr. Gary Kessler from the Atlantic Council. Will Loomis is an assistant director with the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. In this role, he manages a wide range of projects at the nexus of geopolitics and national security within cyberspace. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, he worked on market research and strategy at an emerging technology startup in Madrid, Spain. Originally from New York, he holds a BA in political science with a focus on international relations and security studies from Colgate University. Most importantly, Will is also a certified bourbon steward. Dr. Gary C. Kessler, or Kess to his friends, is the co-author of a recent JSOU press monograph about the impact of maritime cyber vulnerabilities on irregular warfare in the littoral zone, and the co-author of a book about maritime cybersecurity. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a retired professor of cybersecurity, and a principal consultant at Fathom 5. He also holds a national office in the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary Cybersecurity Division and is a visiting faculty member at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Living in the Daytona Beach area, Gary is a scuba instructor with a captain's license. Gentlemen, let's jump right into it. So I've recently read several pieces by Dr. Kessler on maritime cybersecurity, as well as the National Maritime Cybersecurity Plan, and now this report. Is there something that has spurred all this recent interest in maritime cybersecurity?
Yeah, and I'm happy to, as you're referencing Kess's pieces, happy to turn it over to here in a second. I would just hit kind of like three items that I feel like has really contributed a lot to the velocity around this issue set right now. And I think, honestly, they're very interconnected. First is I would think that, the pandemic and a lot of the issue set around COVID has really brought an increased level of attention to supply chain issues and those within the maritime domain as more specifically. So obviously the Ever Given incident in the Suez Canal was a really prime example of this type of disruption, but we've also seen it a lot right now outside the port of Long Beach in California as well. So I think the pandemic has really demonstrated the importance of these types of maritime networks, as well as the potential impact of disruptions. I think the second is just the evolving threat landscape around the maritime domain and how we've seen that shift over the course of the last year and a half. So I think the two major statistics that we talk about in the report in terms of this is the 400% increase in cyber attacks targeting the maritime transportation sector, as well as the 900% increase on attacks targeting operational technology. And we've seen some really big, punchy kind of operations in the last couple of months and years. So obviously NotPetya in 2017, while not targeting the maritime domain, had some really substantial effects. And we've seen all four of the biggest owner operators, commercial shipping companies on the globe actually hit with ransomware in the last year. So it's clear that there are more actors actively targeting this landscape. And I think that has brought a lot of attention to it. And finally, and I think honestly, this is directly correlated to a lot of what I just mentioned in the first two, but we've seen a lot of increased U.S. government attention on this issue set, as well as more international attention as well. The National Maritime Cyber Plan that you mentioned is a really good example of that. But I think we've seen over the course of the last year, highlighting stuff like the new cyber strategic outlook from the Coast Guard, as well as some recent activity on the Hill, just to kind of demonstrate that there's a lot of activity within and a lot of interest within USG to really tackle this problem head on, and hence kind of one big reason why we decided to tackle it. But I'm sure Kess has extra things that he'd like to add there.
No, actually, I let you go first on that, Will, purposefully, because I mean, I've been writing about this for a while, and I'm not the only one. A number of people have been talking about this for a while. But your question sort of smacked to me of why now? And I think the two things that happened, in addition to what Will said, is clearly somebody got to the ear of the White House and said, we need to have a plan. Why maritime and not aviation? Well, because somebody got the ear of somebody who said maritime's important. But I think at the same time, what's been happening with all the incidents that Will was talking about is it's now making national news. It's no secret to anybody on this call that maritime cyber has been a problem for years, but now it's making national news and people are talking about it.
Fantastic. And I'm glad that they are talking about it, especially after reading your report and your JSOU press monograph. So gentlemen, can you tell us a little bit about your report and why it's of interest to the special operations community?
Yeah, Kess, you want to go first, and I'm happy to build on your answer.
Well, so I think why it's of interest to special operations is because of where special operations is geographically doing their stuff. And of course, Mark, I mean, you're obviously well aware of the paper that Diane Zori and I worked on, talking specifically about irregular warfare in the littoral zone. There are so many cybersecurity issues that can be bad in open water. And if somebody is in blue water, when they're in brown water, they can be downright fatal. And I think that is one of the reasons special ops, needs to be concerned.
I think I would just add one more. I mean, we talked a lot about in the report how maritime insecurity around cyber is not just an economic or energy security problem, but it's also a national security problem. And one of kind of like the key factors that we hit there is the reliance on maritime infrastructure and maritime transport for sea lift and for key transportation of infrastructure and goods during times of conflict. And I think we've seen this a lot in the last 2 decades around kind of activity in the Middle East and some really key efforts down there. And as Kess said, one little cyber operation, one little kind of attack can cause really lasting and substantial ramifications from that. So I think that there's definitely some really, really strong significance around the need to have this type of infrastructure to support operations, whether it's high intensity or low intensity conflicts, and being able to better secure that infrastructure is a critical part of enabling that type of activity.
Sure. So I guess building off of those responses, how might maritime transportation be disrupted through cyberspace operations below the level of armed conflict by a nation state that wants to retain plausible deniability?
Well, I will observe that almost any cyber attack provides plausible deniability because of the difficulty with probability 1 knowing where the attack came from. I mean, I often compare this to a missile. If somebody fires a missile, I've got enough satellite and thermal imaging. I can tell you the latitude and longitude that missile came from. Cyber attacks are a little bit harder because, in fact, although we know the fingerprints of what various attack groups look like, well, the attack groups also know the fingerprints of what the attack groups look like. And what kind of attacker would I be if I couldn't launch an attack, a cyber attack, and make it look like it had your fingerprints on it? The other thing is, though, that there's all sorts of ways in which I can attack. I mean, in this case, let's say I want to attack military vessels. I'm a big believer in the oblique attack. Attack a port. If I can somehow attack a port with, let's say, a ransomware attack, like has been done at any number of ports, and I can shut down the port, how many ports have mixed civilian and military vessels where the military vessels are in the back of the port? Well, if I can screw up the front of the port, I can certainly interfere with the transit of military vessels, both the ingress and the egress. Attacks on GPS and AIS. It's already been shown, even I have shown it, how trivial it is to send false information via GPS or particularly AIS. And again, it's almost impossible to ascertain where those attacks are coming from. So I think there are tons of ways, short of armed conflict, where I can alter, shipping, even if I don't attack directly a ship.
Yeah, I think Kess did a great job of hitting options. And honestly, I think there are many different kind of like tactics and attack vectors out there that one could target while still kind of maintaining this level of plausible deniability. One thing that I would just add on what Kess said is something that even makes that ability for a nation state to do an operation against the maritime domain or any domain in cyberspace while remaining that plausible deniability is the proliferation of tools that has really happened a lot in the last couple of years, and the leveling of different actors in cyberspace and how muddied that can be on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis. We talk a little bit about this in the report, but it can be very challenging to determine whether activity is coming from a cyber criminal organization or a ransomware gang versus a state-supported organization versus a state-sponsored activity versus something that's actually coming from an intelligence service. And we've often seen it be very difficult to attribute differences between those levels. And as offensive capabilities, as more complex and more sophisticated tools for cyber attacks become increasingly proliferated, increasingly for sale on the market, it's going to become harder and harder for individuals on the defensive side to really make that differentiation between, hey, is this a sophisticated cyber attack from a nation state actor, or is this just something that's been passed down to criminal groups or sold on the black market and is not actually as high level as we think it is?
Sure. Sounds like a very complex operating environment. And, as you
Definitely.
know in the report, complexity begets insecurity. So what are the major gaps in maritime cybersecurity that the United States government should be focusing on today?
Give you first hack at this, Kess. Go ahead.
Yeah, it in some ways that's a simply well-articulated question that it's so complex to answer because the maritime transportation system itself is so complex. Because I have to worry about shipping lines, and one way in which I can attack a ship is via the shipping line. Then, of course, I've got the ships itself. But if I were to focus I'm going to focus on two things because to me they're among the biggest threats we have. As soon as we started doing anything digital, we provided an attack vector for outside agents. And so what we're seeing increasingly on ships, and it's important that we actually do see this, is automation. Well, again, once we have more automated systems and in some ways fewer and fewer manual backups or manual overrides, but also increasingly a workforce that understands how to operate the automated system and doesn't necessarily understand how to put in the manual override. And in fact, we have also seen on Navy vessels, for fine examples of such a complex human machine interface that nobody can quickly correct a problem that is being put in by an automated system. But furthermore, we're going very rapidly into an environment where we're going to see fully autonomous vessels and fully autonomous systems. And everything that I'm seeing appears to be adding security. One of Will's lines is we need to be doing security by design rather than security by implementation. Security at the very instance of design is incredibly important. And I don't know how the government can make that happen. I think the industry needs to help make that happen. The second piece I would look at, though, again, I hate to focus always on the same thing, though it's critically important, is navigation, particularly if we're going to have nav systems that are driving autonomous vessels, because autonomous vessels still need to comply with all the collision regulations. Well, the collision regulations means that, vessels needs to be reporting its position. It needs to have, how are you going to have a lookout on an autonomous vessel unless you have a whole boatload of cameras, no pun intended. And, me, the remote captain at my bridge here in my office at home. But if I can talk to that ship, it is naive to believe that a bad guy can't also talk to that ship. And so, but well, that's again on automation, but I'm going to wrap around finally to nav systems. We need to be working very, very rapidly on some sort of augmentation, supplement, backup, what have you, to the current primary form of position, navigation, and timing that we use today, which is GPS. And I observed that many of our adversaries who are quite good at spoofing GPS have land-based alternatives to their navigation systems. And it's unclear that we have that for our navigation system.
Yeah, it's time to bring out, what is it, the sextant, or however they used to navigate by stars, really go
or
purely.
E-Loran, you know,
Yeah,
I know how to use Loran. I'm old.
I'm good to go back to the physical systems. But just to kind of build on what Kes was saying for a second and to zoom out a little bit, I think the two things, and for me, the two major gaps that I would like to see USG focus on is, we talk, for number one, we talk a lot about the report about how the MTS is not kind of a one size fits all like being, but it's a system of systems. And I really kind of want the key entities here to drill down past like what are the things that we can do for the whole MTS, and just start looking a little bit more at the segments to better understand what kind of like best practices and security looks like for an oil tanker, for a commercial shipping, for a port, for these different sub entities. There's already some great work going on right now with MITRE and NIST to try and do some framework profiles on different entities in the MTS, but would love to continue to build out that work because it's so important to understand what the threat profiles look like for different entities within the MTS, so that we can then build to make or push to make them more secure from there. The other thing is, and Kes mentioned this, but I just got to foot stomp it. It's essential that we focus more on education and training within the MTS. And this needs to be not only bringing cybersecurity principles and best practices into the maritime domain, but also bringing maritime into cybersecurity. So teaching those professionals who have spent that time upskilling technically and really understanding threat landscapes in the cybersecurity space, and bringing them into the MTS so they understand how those risks and systems kind of fit uniquely for the MTS, and then how to mitigate them.
So I certainly want to come back around and touch upon the training and education piece, as well as the PNT systems that Kes mentioned. But I want to kind of build off that last question and ask, in your estimation, what is the right balance between convenience and security regarding maritime operations?
I would just say that, I think that we've seen a lot of push in the last couple of years, and there's a lot of momentum right now about using kind of new technology and new innovation to drive up efficiency and to really kind of increase that bottom line for private sector owner operators. And with that, I think we've seen a huge increase in the attack surface, or the numbers of vulnerable systems that exist on those platforms that have really increased the risk for cybersecurity compromise. And for me, and I think Kes mentioned this a second ago when he talked about secure by design, it's really important for the folks who are using those systems, whether it be USG, whether it be owner operators of ships, whether it be international actors, to be working closely with those vendors, those system vendors, to push towards a more secure by design model. So just to kind of like give a sense of what that looks like, every time you add like a new remotely controlled ballast system to a boat, or you stack on new levels of technology, I want that to be done in a secure way. And that means, not connecting it to Wi-Fi systems. That means keeping it differentiated from the IT networks on a particular ship. There's a lot of what goes into that process, but that's one that for me needs to be a big priority in order to kind of balance that scale right now. I think right now it's like efficiency and convenience up here and security way, way lower on the other side. I would love to see that even closer to even. I'm not sure we can get to this leveling, which is more of what I'm interested in, but I think even is a good goal, and that really needs some attention, not only from USG, but critically the private sector as well, to help push that community towards more secure development and system process practices. But Kes, go ahead. Feel free to add anything more.
Well, That's a great question, and reminds me it's a question that I've been dealing with my entire professional career, which in this case, we're talking the late 1970s. We've been asking this question. If you lock things down so much that people can't do their jobs, they will figure out a way around it. So the question is great, because we actually have to figure out what the right balance is between convenience and security. But at the same time, we also have to recognize the security is not going to be convenient. I used to work in a place where I had to go past a guard booth, show them my badge, and when I went through the second guard booth, they had to touch the front of my badge. That sometimes meant I was waiting in a line. Okay, but where I was working, they had to keep it secure. That was the physical security that we had at the time. We all see now, you log into your bank. Well, you could log into your bank just with a password, but if you're smart about it, you're using two-factor authentication. So you're going to wait for that text message or that duo message or whatever, so you can put in a second passcode. It's a pain in the butt. None of us like it, but how many of us really want to protect our mobile app banking with just a password? So part of it is socializing people, not merely training and educating them about security, but making them intrinsically interested in having a safety culture and recognizing that cybersecurity is part of the safety culture. I don't want anybody to blow up a building while I'm in it, nor do I want anybody breaking into my bank account and taking all of my money.
That's a fantastic analogy. So, I realize that we're talking about complex systems here, but in the report, how maritime cybersecurity is a worldwide issue. So it got me thinking, relatively speaking, how maritime cybersecure is the US compared to its competitors?
Yes, you want to take a first swing at this one? Because I want to kind of like pivot off of it a little bit with my answers. So
okay. Well, I mean, I actually don't know that we're in any better or worse shape than anybody else, because there really is no United States maritime cyber. I mean, we've got our ports. They've all had their problems, yet look around internationally, all the ports have had their problems. If you look in cargo, the major cargo carriers are foreign flagged. Well, not foreign flagged, they're foreign owned companies. The major passenger lines, there are many, US lines, but so the shipping lines have all had their problems. That's global. The International Maritime Organization is, of course, a United Nations organization. And almost every country that has a seaport is a member of IMO. Again, focusing on that global nature. So I don't know that the US is certainly in any worse case. I think that the Coast Guard, in some ways, with their efforts to describe the cyber requirements on maritime facilities, that is the ports, and the fact that not only do the ports have to have a safety plan or a security plan, but they now have to have a cybersecurity annex to that safety plan. I think that's, certainly a step in the right direction and puts us, heads and shoulders above some nations, but there's several other nations that also have similar requirements or are following the Coast Guard's lead.
Well,
yeah, Kez actually kind of hit everything I was going to say.
Oh, I thought you were going to pivot.
Oh, am I muted? No, yeah, good. Kez actually kind of hit. No, I mean, well, we're close. So, the thing that Kez said about the Coast Guard, that was one that I wanted to hit as well. I think that some of the action and the maturity that they have exhibited over the course of the last kind of year and a half, 2 years, kind of gives us a leg up over some of the other international shipping and kind of maritime nations that don't necessarily have somebody playing that role. But largely, to kind of go back to the first part of Kess's answer, the fact that the whole maritime ecosystem is so intrinsically connected, really, I think makes it hard for any one single country or entity to be more cyber secure than the rest by any significant, or insecure by any significant amount, one way or the other. I will say, I think one thing that was interesting is there was a report that came out, I think 4 or 5 years ago, called the Shen report, that talked a little bit about what would happen if one ship with malware on it came and traveled around the world and docked at different ports around the globe. So looking at if it went through Long Beach and then moved over and went through the South China Sea and the Mediterranean, kind of what that would look like and how substantial those kind of effects can be. And that just demonstrates how one little insecure entity in the MTS can really impact, many, many different countries throughout the ecosystem. So, one of the bottom lines of our report is that it's really, really crucial for this to be a global and whole of system approach. We can't just try and fix the maritime cyber issue in the United States. We need to be engaging with other key international partners and entities like the IMO to help make these changes be more global and not just focus on US actors and entities.
Fantastic response. Completely agree. Gary, early on, you brought up the position, navigation, timing systems. In the report, you draw a lot of attention to these PNT systems. How can the U.S. build a more hardened PNT system that would be resistant to attacks on satellites?
Well, I am not a GPS expert. I talk about it a lot. And, I like to talk about problems and then at least suggest a solution. This is an area in which I don't know enough about how to build a hardened GPS. I mean, you look at the military GPS systems, which are encrypted. Well, that's fine, but you can't really do that in a civilian environment because by the time you give the key to everybody, well, everybody's got the key. And by the way, I can still jam military GPS because, I've got a signal coming down to Earth that is, fractions of a watt in power. I mean, who can't jam that? So certainly we need to find alternatives, and people are working on alternatives, some low Earth orbit alternatives. I know that DHS has some PNT hardening programs. I know the IEEE working with DHS is developing some standards. There has been talk about bringing back something like LORAN, which of course, I don't know that can help me internationally if I'm in the middle of the North Atlantic, but so I know that solutions are being discussed. In some ways, the most obvious is one that many of the military are doing. They're carrying GPS units that will track multiple constellations. And so in fact, that was one of the points, that Diane and I made in our paper about tracking multiple constellations. And somebody during the review insisted that we take that out, that it was absurd that the US military would be using GLONASS. Well, and then we found out that's exactly what many of the military units are doing, is they're tracking GLONASS, BeiDou, Galileo, and GPS, and making sure that all the signals are syncing up. And if they're not, they go with the majority.
I've got nothing to add. I just think that people should bring sextants back more because they're cool and they allow us to avoid digital insecurity, but that's a personal thought.
Very nice, very nice. So in the report, you draw a lot of the holes in maritime cybersecurity, and it really seems like a Sisyphean task to locate all those vulnerabilities and protect against all of the exploits. Should we instead focus more on making marine cybersecurity more resilient than trying to protect against all the threats?
Yeah, absolutely. And go ahead, Kerry.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think that's a rule for any system, physical or cyber, actually, that doesn't matter how rock solid your security is, something is going to get through. So you need to build in the resiliency. So that point is absolutely spot on. But I also think that in some case, we have to look at the systems that we're putting in and being very, I'm fading on the wrong word, but we have to look at the systems that we're putting in and we have to focus on getting the vulnerabilities out. And as we identify vulnerabilities, essentially prioritize them, work on the worst ones, But of course, that's the reason we have zero-day attacks, is because, there's 1,000 problems in a Microsoft operating system. Microsoft can only work on the top 100. Well, the next week they've fixed the top 100, but there's now another 100. So there will always be something at the bottom. And that's, of course, is where you get zero-day attacks. We have to just be thoughtful about our software development process. I think our software development process continues to be crappy. And it's clear that this is not totally a technology solution either. One of the points that I make is, humans are a great vector for attack. Social engineering works. We have phishing attacks and ransomware attacks that are so often coming from somebody pressing a button that they shouldn't have pressed. However, we have to stop taking the mindset of blaming our users, because to say that our systems are great, if only we didn't have users, we'd be safe, is sort of taking the posture of, we have given the user a secure system and they're the ones screwing it up. And one of my favorite examples is, we're always told, don't use the preview pane in Outlook because it actually opens the email and executes any active content. Well, why are we telling users not to use the preview pane? Why are we even giving them a preview pane if we know that the preview pane is insecure? So we have to give people secure operating systems, which we're not, and give them secure applications, which we are not. And that may have been waving my hands a lot, but you're right. It's a big task, but something, we need to do it because these threats are existential.
Well said.
Yeah, Mark, thanks a ton for this question, because this is like the perfect question. So three things in my response here, and this is actually an issue that that the Atlantic Council, including my colleague Simon Handler, has thought a lot about in the last year and a half, particularly about how we can protect software reliant mission systems in the defense industrial base. But kind of three things here. First, and Kess mentioned it, compromise is inevitable. If we keep thinking within USG with the mindset that we need to make sure all of our systems are impenetrable, we're going to bashing our head against the wall and not making any progress. So instead of thinking about making everything perfect, what we need to think about is how we can make our systems fail gracefully. So fail in a way that is not catastrophic in terms of effects, and to be more resilient. These often come hand in hand. So, because it's, hey, how do we set up our systems so if they get compromised, if they fail, there are resilient backups behind it that can allow these key processes to continue and minimize the effects of a disruption caused by a compromise. The second big thing here is that and I think USG has done a really good job of this recently. After SolarWinds, one of the priorities of Biden's executive order on cybersecurity was to identify what is qualified as critical software. I think that's something that is a really good lesson to pull into the MTS as well. We need to think carefully and deeply about what systems and vulnerabilities are the most impactful systemically across the ecosystem, and then focus on making those more resilient and better protected first, prioritizing the ones with the most impact. And then finally, and I honestly think Kess mentioned this as well in one way or another, but I think it's really important for us to be looking forward instead of backward when we're thinking about how to protect. I think, honestly, all of our systems sit more systemically outside of the MTS as well, but also for the MTS, we need to think more forward about what these compromises could look like, and what potential adversaries are going to look to target. This really gets back to what Kess was talking about earlier in terms of, new technology, new automation, increasing use of IoT and stuff like smart ports. These are going to be the attack vectors that our adversaries will be looking at down the road. And we need to be thinking about how we can protect those and make them resilient, and not just be focused on the problems that we're seeing in the wild today.
Great recommendations by both of you. And speaking of recommendations, in the report, at the end of the report, you put forward many recommendations, and they're all very actionable recommendations, and I appreciated them. But it got me thinking, what is the risk of not acting on maritime cybersecurity?
I mean, this is a fun one because this is literally just us thinking about all the different cool, ugly situations that can happen. I think one that we talked about in we used as a kind of a quote unquote war game scenario for our Cyber 912 DC competition in 2020. Talked a lot about a situation very similar to what I talked about earlier with the Shen report, where a single piece of malware was transferred from a boat to ports across the world and to other ships, and how the compounding and cascading effects of something like that can completely disrupt the global economic ecosystem. So in that scenario, we looked at it happening right leading into the Christmas season, and the crazy compounding effects of supply chain disruptions there, as well as the ability of using that type of disruption and the cascading effects from that type of disruption as a cover for a second type of attack or a second type of activity. So this is something Kes talked a little bit about earlier, about using one type of activity to create other effects. So, just for example, the malware in this particular case shut down the inventory management and inventory processing systems for a whole set of ports and ships. And in this scenario, a bad actor was actually able to sneak physical, like malicious activity, like weapons and arms and stuff on a ship, because these processes were disrupted. So that's just one example. I'm sure Kes has many, many, many uglier examples of kind of what this can look like if activity is not taken. But really, and I think some of the case studies that we mentioned earlier, looking at NotPetya and some of the other ports, are really the low end of kind of what the worst case scenario can look like here. So we really need to take action before people start actually hitting operational technology and getting some of those scarier effects that really makes it more of a safety problem and less of a security issue. But go ahead, Kes.
I actually have a couple of answers. I said earlier that I think that the threats that we're talking about in cyber in general are potentially existential, particularly as our society as a whole becomes more and more dependent upon the information infrastructure that we have. And I'm not just talking about all of us walking around with our phones. Oh my God, what would I do without my phone? It is way more fundamental than that. I think that maritime, and again, Will mentioned this when he talked about supply chain, but let's talk about Maersk for a second. Maersk, I think, took 10 days to recover their entire network and put it back together. Pretend for a second that all of the Maersk ships stopped for 10 days, which they didn't, but imagine what would have happened if they did. I think that there is a Maersk vessel entering or leaving a port somewhere around the world, something like every 15 minutes. I forget what the percentage of global trade is carried by Maersk. After 9/11, planes were not allowed to fly in the United States for, I think, 3 days. People were very unhappy for all the obvious reasons. And well, they should have been. But people don't think about ships, probably because none of us go anywhere on a ship. Well, we do. We leave from Fort Lauderdale, and a week later, we're back at Fort Lauderdale, or all of the cargo that goes on ships. One of the things that Will keeps reminding people that I say, and it's not just me, I'm repeating what a lot of people are saying, the United States is a maritime nation. I think that's one of the things we try to bring out in the report by talking about our dependence on maritime for our food security, our energy security, our homeland security, our national security. And if you take ships out of the picture, our entire structure of our society and our economy is literally in peril.
You're right.
I hope I haven't put too fine a point on that.
Sure. And you are right. This is a risk that we often do not think about or even consider unless we're going on that cruise that comes back in 1 week from the Bahamas.
Where we started.
Yeah.
Royal Caribbean, yeah.
Yeah, right. So as promised, I wanted to bring this back to education and training. You note in the report that all ports are different, all ships are different, all the software running on those ships is different. Given that reality, what type of cyber training and education would be most beneficial to the maritime community?
I think that a lot of the problems we have in maritime with related to cyber when it comes to the user, much like everywhere else we see, is poor cyber hygiene. And, you know, to a certain degree, you need to do your awareness training. You can't really get away from that. Although I'll be the first to acknowledge that having the annual cyber awareness training at work is almost worthless, because people being what they are. There are any number of cases where, you know, people have taken the training and 2 weeks later, they get a phishing email that they respond to. So the two things, and I may have said this before, but I'll say it again. We have to view security as part of a safety culture. We need to have a cyber secure culture. We also have to intrinsically motivate people. And if, for example, people can be intrinsically motivated to protect their own email, their own financial applications, even their Facebook page, if they're still using it. And if they are taught how to protect their own individual assets, hopefully that will give many people the aha moment to realize, wow, this relates to work as well. If I'm not clicking on an attachment, my personal email, why would I click on attachments in my work email? And if you make people part of the solution, rather than, you know, beat them up on merely on problems, and fully engage them as we do with physical site security, I think that is an approach that at least has a fighting chance of working. I will tell you that the bad guys are professionals, however. Our adversary is not the 11th grader at the high school across the street. It is professional people who know how to socially engineer smart, prepared people to do things they're not supposed to do. And we have to recognize that's who we're trying to defend against.
Yeah, I think Tess kind of did a really good job, as always, answering that question. I think that I would just say, to kind of build on that, to foot stomp, first of all, that the understanding of kind of what is best practices and just basic cyber hygiene is really kind of what is most important, and what we can kind of what we can use to raise that baseline the most with the little bit amount of effort. And really what I want to say is we need to have every single mariner have a baseline understanding of. That being said, kind of zooming out from there for a second, I know I mentioned this earlier, but I would like to kind of push more training in regards to MTS specific threats on cybersecurity professionals, and more training on cybersecurity, kind of more in-depth stuff on the security and safety professionals in the MTS. So it really needs to be both ways. Obviously, I want Maritime to better understand the principles around cybersecurity and cybersecurity awareness, but I also want cybersecurity community and the key incident responders and protectors in that field to also better understand the nuances and the system-specific details of the MTS. So it really needs to go both ways, in my opinion. But Kess really hit all the other key points, and I just to end here, I think that the desire and the need for more cybersecurity education and training around maritime is a huge issue, and one that I think for us is one of the 2 or 3 short list of biggest items that need to be hit first in order to raise the baseline for cyber here.
Well, I'll throw out one more quick thing, and we talk about it in the report, but you know, Will talks about foot stomping. Information security is not information technology. They're not the same thing, not the same skill set, should not be the same staff. And I think that what we seriously need to consider, that on every big vessel, you have a chief engineer, you've got a chief nav officer, you've got, you know, your loading people and all that kind of stuff. So you've got the ship's master, obviously, but then there are chiefs that have specific responsibilities. For all I know, they do have a chief IT officer. What most of them do not have is a chief information security officer. And I think that certainly, you know, not every single vessel, but above a certain size or a certain capacity or a certain number of passengers, what have you, whatever the, you know, the SOLAS rules are, I think we need to consider having somebody on board who has specific knowledge of information security to help us understand when we're having an event on a vessel, is this something broke, or is there something here that's really weird that I ought to be taking some action about? I'm going to give an example that I don't know that is necessarily pertinent to this specific question, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. In February of this year, a vessel called the Maersk Eindhoven in heavy seas off of Japan lost power for 4 minutes. They lost 2% of their cargo overboard. Now, they lost power because the oil sensor sent a message saying oil pressure was low. The engine had an automatic cutoff, because obviously, if you think that there's low oil pressure and you don't shut yourself off, what's going to happen to the engine? It's going to seize up and you're going to have no power at all, because almost all commercial vessels are single screw. They don't need 2 screws like a Navy ship where somebody's firing torpedoes at them. So, they tend to be single screw vessels. So it dawns on me, this is a great man-in-the-middle attack. How about if I just take a Raspberry Pi, insert it somewhere into the network, obviously some form of insider attack, or a Stuxnet-like attack that I build in during manufacture, different story, and I wait until I'm triggered. I wait to see the vessel having large amount of roll, pitch, and yaw, indicating heavy seas. And now I spoof the oil sensor indicator and I send out a low oil pressure message. How long will it take anybody to figure out I don't have low oil pressure? Turn the engine back on. Took the Maersk Eindhoven only 4 minutes, which is a pretty quick response. They still lost 2% of their cargo overboard.
Yeah, I think what this goes to show is, just little improvements in cybersecurity can go a long way.
Absolutely.
I recently read a report that said, just raising the bar ever so slightly would reduce 80 to 90% of cyber intrusions or cybersecurity issues at an organization. So, gentlemen, Will, Kess, I'd like to thank you so much for this discussion today. Hopefully the audience enjoyed the discussion, and if so, I definitely recommend that you read their full report from October 2021 titled Raising the Colors, Signaling for Cooperation on Maritime Cybersecurity, and it's available at the Atlantic Council. Thank you again for tuning in for another Think JSOU discussion.